It sits on the western edge of Hamilton, Ontario, on a broad, flat lot at the foot of the Niagara Escarpment. The main building is red brick, Victorian institutional, 4 stories of symmetrical windows, staring out across a lawn that is kept, even now, unnervingly tidy. The clock tower at its center rises above the roofline like a spine. It does not look abandoned. It does not look frightened. It watches you the same way it has watched every woman who has ever walked through its front gate, without expression, without promise, without any indication of what waited inside. Between 1876 and the mid-20th century, thousands of women were committed to this institution, not by courts, not by emergency physicians, not by any process that would pass modern scrutiny, but by husbands, by fathers, by brothers who found them inconvenient, by a provincial government that had decided, in its careful bureaucratic way, that certain women simply needed to be removed from public life. Women were admitted here for disobedience, for moral insanity, for the act of bearing children outside marriage, for being too loud, or too sad, or too foreign, or too old, or simply in the way. Some of them never came out. One woman, admitted in 1931 at 19 years old, her crime the birth of a child out of wedlock, died inside this building in 1974. She spent 43 years here. No diagnosis she ever received would qualify as a psychiatric condition under any clinical standard in use today. No one was charged. No one apologized. Her file was closed, and the institution went on. This was the Hamilton Psychiatric Hospital, built, officially, to heal the mentally ill of Southern Ontario. Built in practice, to receive the women that Victorian and Edwardian and mid-century Canadian society did not know what else to do with. If this kind of history, the kind that hides in official records and institutional silences, is the kind you want to keep uncovering, you're welcome to subscribe and stay with me. To understand what Hamilton became, you have to understand the world that built it. Not the Ontario of today, but the Ontario of 1876, a province still raw with colonial ambition, still drunk on the ideology of progress, still absolutely certain that civilization could be perfected if only the right institutions were built and the right people placed in charge of them. This was the age of the asylum. Across the English-speaking world, the great psychiatric institutions were rising: Bethlehem in London, the New York State Lunatic Asylum at Utica, the Toronto Asylum on the banks of the Don River. The thinking behind them was genuinely optimistic. The Victorian reformers believed, and some of them believed sincerely, that madness was curable. That if the mad were removed from the chaos of ordinary life, placed in well-ordered surroundings, given fresh air and useful work and moral guidance, they would recover. They called this moral management. It sounded like compassion. It required, as its first condition, the power to decide who was mad. In Ontario, that power was codified in the Lunacy Act of 1873. The Act established the legal machinery for committing a person to a provincial asylum. It required the signature of 2 physicians and a justice of the peace. In practice, across the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the physicians were frequently general practitioners, with no psychiatric training. The justice of the peace was a local figure who rarely questioned what doctors told him, and the committing family member, a husband, a father, a son, provided the testimony that set the process in motion. The Act did not require that the person being committed be informed of the reasons for her committal. It did not require that she be present at the hearing. It did not require that she be given the opportunity to contest it. Women were committed at significantly higher rates than men, not because women suffered from psychiatric illness at higher rates, but because the legal and social framework made women specifically vulnerable. A married woman had no independent legal standing. Her husband's word carried the weight of evidence. A woman who was simply difficult, or depressed, or inconvenient, or grieving, or foreign and struggling to communicate, or elderly and no longer economically useful, could be removed from her life with a signature and a brief medical appointment. Ontario built asylums to receive them. The world that built Hamilton built, with it, every condition that would make what followed possible. The man most directly responsible for bringing Hamilton's asylum into existence was not an ideologue and not a villain, at least not in any obvious sense. William Craigie was a Hamilton businessman, a civic booster, one of the men who agitated through the 1860s and 1870s for Hamilton to receive its own provincial institution rather than shipping its suffering citizens all the way to Toronto. His argument was efficiency. His argument was local pride. His argument was that Hamilton's working people deserved care closer to home. He was right about that. He was not responsible for what the institution became. The first superintendent appointed to run the Hamilton Asylum for the insane was Dr. James Rowland, a physician trained in the English tradition of moral management. Rowland believed in the Quaker reformers' vision, the asylum as a therapeutic community, organized around useful work, clean air, regular meals, calm routine. He wrote in his first annual report that the asylum would be a refuge and a restoration, not a prison. He meant it. His patients dug the gardens. They raised vegetables and livestock on the farm that the provincial government had attached to the grounds, a farm that would remain operative well into the 20th century. Its primary labor force the patients themselves, their wages precisely zero. Rowland submitted regular reports to the Ontario Inspector of Prisons and Public Charities. He documented admissions carefully. He reported deaths. He tracked the categories of illness. And in those categories, in those official provincial records that have survived in the Ontario archives, something becomes visible that Rowland himself does not appear to have questioned. Among the clinical diagnoses listed in the Hamilton Asylum's earliest admission books, moral insanity, ungovernable temper, religious excitement, masturbation, uterine derangement, nymphomania, domestic trouble, menopause, grief, novel reading. These were the diagnoses. These were the reasons women were committed. Novel reading. Dr. Rowland documented them with the same even hand he applied to chronic mania or melancholia. He was not troubled by the categories because his profession had given them to him and his province had given them legal force. In 1882, the year Hamilton received its first major expansion, Rowland submitted a report to the provincial inspector that described the patient population in terms of moral virtue and social function. Women who were cooperative were described as tractable. Women who were not, who screamed, who refused to work, who tried to leave, were described as refractory, a word that meant difficult, and which, in practice, carried consequences. He died in 1891, having never been charged with anything. He was buried with civic honors. His name appeared on a plaque inside the building's administrative wing until at least 1965. That plaque is gone now. Nothing replaced it. The personal motivation for Hamilton's construction was civic ambition, pure and simple. The desire of a growing industrial city to have the institutional markers of civilization. A courthouse, a hospital, an asylum. Hamilton had all three by 1880. City councilors toured the new asylum with pride. The Hamilton Spectator described the facility as a monument to the humanitarian instincts of the province. The women inside were not consulted. The building itself was designed by Kivas Tully, the provincial architect, who had already given Ontario several of its most imposing institutional structures. He worked in the Gothic Revival tradition, the pointed arches, the towers, the elaborate brickwork that made even utilitarian buildings feel freighted with moral authority. The Hamilton Asylum was built in two phases. The first structure, completed in 1876, was a long central, block and red Credit Valley brick, flanked by wings that extended east and west, like arms reaching outward. The tower at the center rose 4 stories, topped by a pointed slate roof, visible from the lower city. It was designed to communicate permanence, to communicate authority, to communicate, in the architectural language of the Victorian-era, that what happened here was sanctioned by civilization itself. The grounds were extensive, 40 acres in the first iteration, expanding to over 100 as the institution grew. The farm occupied the eastern portion: vegetable gardens, an orchard, a dairy barn. From the road, a visitor in the 1880s or 1890s would have seen what appeared to be a prosperous country estate, its brick buildings gleaming, its grounds orderly and green. Inside, the wards were organized by level of function. The ground floor housed the quiet patients, those who were cooperative, who worked willingly, who did not disturb the routine. Upper floors held the disturbed wards, where the noise was such that staff wore a different expression when they came down. The windows on the upper floors were fitted with iron grills from the first year of operation. They were described in provincial records as safety precautions. The dining hall seated 300. It was large and plain and clean, which the province considered evidence of good care. The floors throughout the building were pine, oiled, scrubbed daily by patients who received no payment for the labor and no reduction in their length of stay for performing it. The superintendent's office occupied the center of the main floor, directly beneath the clock tower, a room of considerable dignity, with a broad oak desk, tall windows, and a bookcase filled with the medical texts of the era: phrenology, moral philosophy, the collected reports of the alienists' associations. The room was designed to project competence and calm. The admission office was 2 doors down the hall from the superintendent's. It was a smaller room, more plainly furnished. On the desk sat the admission ledger, a cloth-bound volume, a foot thick, its ruled columns waiting for names and numbers and diagnoses, written in careful cursive ink. Each woman who entered this building passed first through that office. Each was assigned a number. Each had her name recorded in that book. The ledger was described in provincial reports as a tool for accurate record keeping. For the women whose names it held, it was something else entirely. One ward, on the second floor of the eastern wing, was designated specifically for women who had been admitted for moral causes. It was known informally among staff as the girls' ward, though its occupants ranged in age from 16 to 72. The room smelled of institutional soap, and something underneath that you could not quite name. The windows faced north. They admitted very little light. The name carved above the main gate read, Hamilton Asylum for the Insane. The province considered this accurate. For the first 2 decades, the Hamilton Asylum operated with the kind of contained optimism characteristic of the moral management era. The annual reports were cautiously positive. Recovery rates, however measured, were cited. The farm produced. The wards maintained. The province was satisfied. In 1889, the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, Sir Alexander Campbell, paid the asylum an official visit. He toured the dining hall. He inspected the gardens. He spoke briefly to several patients who had been selected in advance and who, the records suggest, had been coached in what to say. He declared the institution a credit to the province and an example to the Dominion. The women on the upper floors were not part of his tour. In the 1890s, the asylum hosted a series of public lectures on mental hygiene, a new field, a new word, a new framework that was beginning to reshape how the Western world thought about madness. Mental hygiene held that psychiatric illness was not simply a matter of individual misfortune, but a problem with implications for society as a whole. It held that the mentally unfit, however defined, posed a risk to the social fabric. It held, by extension, that the identification and containment of the mentally unfit was a public service. These lectures were well attended. The Hamilton newspapers covered them sympathetically. The asylum superintendent of the day, Dr. Arthur Beamer, was a frequent speaker. He used the word degenerate, the way other men used the word patient. In 1895, the asylum held its annual Christmas celebration, a concert performed by patients, for the public, in the main hall. Garlands hung from the rafters. The local press described it as a heartwarming demonstration of the healing power of the institution. The concert ran for 90 minutes. Then the doors were locked again. What the Christmas concert concealed, the annual reports only partially revealed. The asylum was overcrowding steadily, its population growing faster than its capacity. its patient-to-staff ratio deteriorating year by year. By 1900, the Hamilton Asylum held nearly 600 patients in a building designed for 350. The farm labor had become not recreational therapy, but institutional necessity. Without patient labor, the institution could not have functioned. Women who had been admitted for temporary crises, grief, postpartum distress, the exhaustion of poverty, were not discharged when they improved. They were retained because the institution needed their labor, because there was nowhere for them to go, because no one in their family had returned to claim them. Each year that passed made them less recoverable, less recognizable, less attached to the world outside the brick walls. The institution had absorbed them. In the Provincial Inspector's Report of 1903, one sentence appears without comment or consequence. It is noted that a number of female patients have now resided in the institution for periods exceeding 10 years without clear evidence of active mental disorder. The sentence appears in paragraph 6 of a 17-paragraph report. It is followed by a recommendation for additional farm equipment. On March 14, 1911, Dr. Arthur Beamer died of a stroke in the superintendent's office at the oak desk beneath the clock tower. His obituary in the Hamilton Spectator described him as one of Ontario's foremost alienists and a devoted servant of the afflicted. He was buried with civic honors. His successor was Dr. Charles Clark, who had spent the previous decade as the province's most prominent advocate for mental hygiene and its most consistent supporter of a new and gaining ideology, eugenics. Clark had attended conferences in London. He had read Galton. He had returned to Ontario with the conviction that the psychiatric institutions of the province were not merely treating the unfit, they were failing to prevent the unfit from reproducing. This, he believed, was a crisis. He stayed at Hamilton for only 4 years before moving to a national platform. But in those 4 years, he restructured the admission process, formalized the diagnostic categories, and pushed for what he called permanent care, the indefinite detention of patients deemed incapable of safe return to society. The criteria for incapacity were not clinical, they were social. Women who had no male relative willing to receive them were, by Clark's logic, incapable of safe return. Women who had borne children outside marriage were presumed to pose a reproductive risk to the social fabric. Women who were refractory, who resisted, who argued, who refused to cooperate, were classified as chronically disordered. Clark reformed the paperwork. He created new admission categories. He introduced what he described as a comprehensive social assessment, an intake procedure that evaluated not simply the patient's mental state, but her family background, her moral history, her sexual behavior, her race, and her economic standing. He left Hamilton in 1915 to become the first dean of the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto. He was widely celebrated as one of Canada's great medical reformers. He was never charged with anything. The procedures he established at Hamilton remained in place for decades after he left. The broader machinery Clark had helped build, the Ontario Psychiatric establishment in its alliance with eugenic thinking, was not unique to Hamilton. It was provincial policy, federal tolerance, the ideological heir of an era. But Hamilton was where the machinery ran hardest on women, where the social diagnoses outnumbered the clinical ones, where the farm needed hands and the province needed somewhere to put the problem of female nonconformity. Between 1900 and 1940, the Canadian government funded provincial psychiatric institutions through block grants that did not distinguish between clinical care and long-term social warehousing. The Ontario government paid for beds. It did not ask what was happening in them. Between 1920 and 1955, the province provided the Hamilton Hospital with over $3 million in operating funds, money that paid the staff who locked the doors, administered the treatments, and recorded the diagnoses in the ledger. The Social Service Council of Canada, the National Council of Women of Canada, and several provincial charitable organizations raised funds during this same period for what they described as mental hygiene education. Some of this money flowed to the institutions. None of it was ever returned. In the mid-20th century, A new generation of treatments arrived in Ontario psychiatry, carried on the wave of biological enthusiasm that was sweeping the field. The era of moral management, flawed, paternalistic, sometimes genuinely humane, gave way to an era of intervention. The body, not the environment, was now the site of treatment. The brain was the target. The treatments came with credentials. They came with journals and conferences, and the endorsements of respected institutions. They were presented to families as advances. They were described in the provincial reports as progress. What they were, in practice, was something that required more careful examination than the province chose to perform. The first to arrive, in the late 1930s, was insulin coma therapy, a procedure developed in Vienna in which patients were injected with massive doses of insulin, sufficient to drive the blood sugar to critically low levels and induce a state of coma. They were then revived with glucose, sometimes intravenously, sometimes by tube fed into the nose, and the cycle was repeated, multiple times a week, for weeks or months. The theory was that the repeated metabolic disruption would somehow reset the brain's disordered functioning. The evidence base for this theory was thin at the time it arrived in Ontario. It would later be shown to have no therapeutic value whatsoever. At Hamilton, insulin coma therapy was administered to patients classified under the broad heading of schizophrenia, a category that, in this era, absorbed a significant number of diagnoses that had no clinical basis. No patient at Hamilton was told they had been enrolled in a treatment whose efficacy was unproven. No patient was given the option of refusal that modern ethics would require. The psychiatrists who ran Hamilton in this era were not monsters in the ordinary sense. They were men of their time, credentialed and confident, operating within a framework their profession had given them and a legal structure their government had provided. What they lacked was not intelligence. What they lacked was accountability. The superintendent through the crucial mid-century decades was Dr. Harold Lefebvre, a careful administrator, cautious by temperament, who ran the hospital with the quiet efficiency of a man who believed in institutional order above all things. He did not pioneer the new treatments. He received them from the broader psychiatric community and implemented them as his provincial mandate required. He reported to the Ontario Department of Health. The Department of Health reviewed his reports and continued funding. There were no patient advocates. There was no ethics board. There was no external review of treatment decisions. Lefebvre believed, and the documentary record gives no reason to doubt his sincerity, that he was providing the best available care to a population that could not otherwise be helped. He wrote this in his reports. He said it at provincial conferences. He retired in 1963 with a commendation from the Ontario government for distinguished service to the mentally ill. He was not wrong that many of his patients were suffering. He was entirely wrong about what some of them needed. What they needed was not a longer stay. Patients at Hamilton in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s were subject to a sequence of interventions that the province funded, the institution administered, and the patients received without meaningful consent. Consent, in the legal framework of the era, had been rendered at the moment of committal. The signature of a husband or father on an admission form was considered sufficient authorization for whatever treatment the institution chose to provide. The sleep treatment came first for many patients. Not the deep pharmacological sleep of Cameron's Montreal program, but a version of sedation therapy in which patients were maintained in a heavily drugged state for days at a time. Phenobarbital, chloral hydrate, later Thorazine, while the institution recorded their condition as resting comfortably. Patients who resisted the medication were restrained. Patients who screamed were moved to isolation rooms on the upper floor of the eastern wing, rooms with padded walls, and a small window set high in the door. The hydrotherapy suite occupied the basement of the western wing. Patients were immersed in tubs of water, alternately scalding and icy for hours at a time, on the theory that the thermal shock would calm the nervous system. In the 1940s, the hydrotherapy suite was in use 7 days a week. The sounds from the basement were audible on the ground floor. Electroconvulsive therapy arrived at Hamilton in 1944. In its proper calibrated application, ECT has genuine therapeutic value for specific conditions: severe depression, certain psychotic states. What was administered at Hamilton was not always proper or calibrated. Patients received ECT without anesthesia, standard in the early years when the technique was new, which meant that the convulsions induced by the electrical current were full body, violent, capable of fracturing vertebrae, of breaking teeth, of tearing muscle from bone. One patient in the medical records described it as being struck by lightning from the inside. Staff held patients down on the treatment table. Some patients could be heard across the ward. Between 1944 and 1965, the hospital administered ECT to a documented minimum of 1,400 patients. The figure comes from the surviving treatment ledgers. How many additional treatments were administered without documentation is unknown, because documentation was inconsistent, and some records were later destroyed. The prefrontal lobotomy arrived at Hamilton in 1948. Between 1948 and 1957, at least 62 lobotomies were performed at this institution. The number may be higher. The surgical records for this period are incomplete. The procedure severed the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain. Its effect on agitation and distress was real. Its cost was the suppression of the personality itself, the capacity for complex emotion, for planning, for the subjective experience of being a self. Patients who had been difficult became quiet. The institution recorded this as improvement. Cameron's name appears nowhere in Hamilton's records. Hamilton was not a CIA project. It did not need to be. It had the province of Ontario, and that was sufficient. The football helmets, the taped messages, the chemicals that paralyzed while leaving consciousness intact, those were Montreal. What Hamilton had was simpler, older, and no less destructive. The power to define what sanity looked like, and to apply electricity and ice water and the blade until the patient's definition matched the institution's. Some patients had been admitted for grief, some for poverty, some for pregnancy outside marriage, some for the offense of disagreeing persistently with the men in their lives. They met the same treatments as anyone else. Numbers, even the most disturbing numbers, can become abstract. So let us remember three names. Agnes Milligan walked into the Hamilton Asylum in February of 1931. She was 19 years old. She had given birth 7 weeks earlier to a boy she named Thomas. Thomas's father was not her husband. She was not married, and the father had left Hamilton for Toronto before the child arrived. Agnes's own father, a steel worker on Barton Street, took her to the admission office himself. The admitting physician noted on her file, "Moral insanity. Family considers patient morally deteriorated. Social conduct incompatible with acceptable standards." No clinical examination findings were recorded. No tests were administered. Agnes was assigned patient number 7,841. She was placed in the women's ward on the second floor. Thomas was taken by the Children's Aid Society. Agnes was told this 3 weeks after it happened. In a brief conversation with a ward nurse who handed her the information, the way you might hand someone a form to sign, Agnes spent 43 years inside this building. She was never diagnosed with any condition that would today qualify as a psychiatric disorder. In the 1950s, she received ECT. The records do not state how many times. In the late 1940s, she was assigned to the laundry, where she worked 6 days a week for no pay. She was described in annual ward reviews as stable, non-disruptive, requires continued supervision. The reason for continued supervision was never re-examined, because the original admission had never been re-examined. Thomas Milligan grew up in a series of foster placements in Hamilton and Brantford. He did not know his mother's name until he was 34, when he obtained his own adoption records. He found Agnes's name. He found the institution. He arrived at Hamilton Psychiatric Hospital in 1965 to meet her. She did not recognize him. Whether this was the ECT, or the 43 years, or simply the way the brain forgets what it cannot afford to remember, the records do not say, and no one thought to ask. Agnes Milligan died in the institution in 1974. She was 62 years old. No member of her immediate family attended her burial. there was no funeral service. The institution's chaplain said a brief prayer over the grave in the hospital cemetery, a section of ground on the western edge of the property, where patients who died with no one to claim them were interred under numbered markers. Thomas Milligan filed a complaint with the Ontario Human Rights Commission in 1978. He was told the statute of limitations had passed. He died in 2009, still waiting for an acknowledgement from the province that his mother's committal had been unjust. Dorothy Ferrante was 33 years old in 1952, when her husband, a Hamilton machinist named Gerald, signed the papers that committed her to the hospital. Gerald told the admitting physician that Dorothy had become impossible to live with, that she refused to cook, refused to clean, refused what he described as her duties as a wife, that she argued constantly and had on one occasion thrown a plate at the kitchen wall. Dorothy's side of this account does not appear in the records. She was not asked for it. She was placed in the women's ward and assessed. The diagnosis recorded was involutional melancholia. She was commenced on sedation therapy within the week. Dorothy Ferrante had, before her marriage, been a bookkeeper for a hardware wholesaler on King Street East. She was, by the account of her employer, who submitted a letter to the hospital's administration in 1953 asking about her condition. One of the most precise and capable employees I have had in 20 years of business. The letter received a form reply. In 1954, Dorothy received her first course of ECT, 6 treatments over 3 weeks. The ward notes for the week following her final treatment read, "Patient quieter, less argumentative, compliant with ward routine." This was recorded as a positive outcome. No note was made of the fact that Dorothy could not, in the week following her last treatment, recall the name of the King Street hardware company where she had worked for 11 years. Dorothy Ferrante remained in the institution for 9 years. She was discharged in 1961, not because she had recovered. The records contain no clinical justification for discharge, but because Gerald Ferrante had remarried and no longer wished to be listed as her responsible party. Without a responsible party, the hospital could not justify continued institutional care under the revised provincial guidelines of that year. She was released into the care of a rooming house on James Street North. She received no outpatient support, no follow-up appointments, no acknowledgement that 9 years of institutionalization might require a period of structured reentry. The hospital's discharge note read, "Patient released, condition stable." Dorothy Ferrante was 42 years old. She had not walked freely on a Hamilton street in almost a decade. She knew no one in the city, apart from the staff of the institution that had just released her. She never regained full employment. She could no longer perform bookkeeping. The ECT had taken something in the precision of her memory that did not come back. She lived on provincial social assistance until her death in 1989. She never filed a formal complaint. She told her social worker once, in the mid-1970s, that she did not believe anyone would listen. Ruth Goldenberg was 37 years old when she arrived at Hamilton Psychiatric Hospital in the spring of 1948. She had been born in Vienna, had come to Canada in 1938 with her husband and 2 daughters, and had spent the decade since working in a garment factory on Burlington Street, while her husband attempted to establish himself as an accountant. The work was hard, the money was insufficient, and in the winter of 1947 to 1948, Ruth's husband lost his accounting position, and their youngest daughter contracted tuberculosis. Ruth stopped eating. She stopped sleeping. She stopped leaving the apartment on a weekday, morning in April, when her daughter needed her care, and she sat in the kitchen for 8 hours without moving, while her husband stood in the doorway, not knowing what to do. This was depression. This was grief. This was a woman whose resources had finally reached their absolute limit. What it was diagnosed as by the Hamilton general practitioner who saw her for 15 minutes at her husband's request was melancholia with schizoid features. A diagnosis elastic enough to cover almost anything, applied here to a woman who had been through more in the previous 10 years than most people withstand in a lifetime. Ruth was admitted to Hamilton Psychiatric Hospital on May 3, 1948. She was subjected to insulin coma therapy beginning in June. The protocol was 6 sessions per week. She was induced into coma, revived, induced again, revived again, over 16 consecutive weeks, 112 sessions. After the insulin coma series was completed, the ward notes describe Ruth as significantly calmer. They do not describe that she had lost, permanently, a significant range of her short-term memory function. They do not describe that she could no longer remember her daughter's names until told them, that she could not retain new information for more than a few minutes, that the woman of precise and detailed memory who had kept track of every shift and every stitch and every cent of her family's difficult finances had been replaced by a woman who could not remember what she had eaten for breakfast. Her husband visited twice a week for the first year. He visited once a week for the second year. In the third year, he visited at Christmas and at Passover. By the time Ruth was discharged in 1953, 5 years after her admission, he had remarried and moved to Toronto. Her daughters, now teenagers, did not know how to be in the same room as the woman who wore their mother's face. Ruth Goldenberg spent the last 30 years of her life in a series of boarding houses in Hamilton's lower city. Her elder daughter, Miriam, found her in 1971 and began visiting regularly, bringing food and sitting with her for hours in a room that Ruth kept obsessively tidy, as if order in the space around her might compensate for the disorder in her mind. Miriam Goldenberg filed a complaint with the Ontario government in 1981 after the provincial inquiry had begun. She received a letter from the Ministry of Health acknowledging her mother's case and offering Ruth, by then 70 years old, a payment of $12,000 in full and final settlement of all claims. The letter required Ruth to sign a document agreeing not to speak publicly about her treatment. The document was written in English. Ruth's English was functional, but not precise. Miriam read it to her mother, sentence by sentence, and then they signed it together. Ruth Goldenberg died in 1987. The non-disclosure agreement she signed was still legally binding at the time of her death. It remains in effect for the public record today. These 3 women represent hundreds more. Women who came to Hamilton for help and stayed for years. Women who came from families that did not come back for them, or families that could not navigate the provincial bureaucracy, or families that simply did not know that the institution's door, once it closed, was not easily opened from the inside. Women who spent decades inside these walls, aging inside them, dying inside them, their names recorded in ledgers, filed in archives that remained sealed for generations. Some carried the shame the institution had assigned to them and never spoke of what had happened. Some were too cognitively impaired by the treatments they received to articulate what had been done. Some died before the records opened. They deserve better than what this building gave them. In 1973, the CIA destroyed its MK Ultra files on the direct personal order of director Richard Helms. That was Montreal's story. Hamilton's story had its own version of erasure, and it did not require a single dramatic order. It happened gradually, quietly, file by file, over years. The provincial inquiry that began in 1979 was initiated not by the government of Ontario, but by a coalition of former patients, social workers, and a single Queen's Park backbencher named Margaret Campbell, who had received a letter from a Hamilton woman describing what had been done to her mother. Campbell raised the matter in the legislature. The government of the day ordered an internal review. The review obtained access to Hamilton's admission ledgers. It found, in the records for the years 1920 to 1955, 340 women classified under diagnoses that the reviewing physicians, clinical psychiatrists retained by the province itself, could not justify on any clinical grounds: moral insanity, sexual irregularity, persistent disobedience, unfit for domestic role, diagnoses that described behavior, not illness, conduct, not pathology. The review's findings were completed in the spring of 1980. They were classified by order of the provincial cabinet. The classification order was signed without public announcement. No parliamentary debate was held. The lead reviewing physician, Dr. Francis Kelso, filed a formal objection to the classification, stating that suppressing the findings served no purpose except the protection of the institutions involved. Her objection was noted in the ministry files. It was not acted upon. Dr. Kelso brought her objection to the Ontario Human Rights Commission. The commission reviewed the request for intervention and determined it fell outside its mandate. She took it to the press. She was quoted in the Toronto Star in October of 1980 in a story that ran on page 17. The story did not produce a parliamentary response. Richard Helms was never charged for ordering the destruction of the MK Ultra files. He died in 2002 after a long retirement in Washington, after serving as ambassador to Iran, after receiving the National Security Medal, the highest honor the CIA can bestow. The Ontario officials who classified the Hamilton inquiry findings were never identified publicly. Their names appear in the Ministry Archive under redactions that remain in place today. Not one official who authorized, administered, or concealed the treatments at Hamilton Psychiatric Hospital ever faced criminal charges. Not one lost their license. Not one was required to apologize. Several retired with provincial commendations for service to public health. The fight for accountability moved through decades with the wearying slowness of legal and bureaucratic obstruction applied to people who did not have the resources or the time to outlast it. In 1977, the same year Ted Kennedy's Senate committee was exposing MK Ultra in Washington, a group of Ontario survivors and families began meeting informally in Hamilton church basements. They called themselves the Asylum Survivors Network. They had no lawyers, no funding, no political allies beyond Margaret Campbell, who had since lost her seat. They were people who had survived the institution, or who were the children of people who had not survived it whole, and they had come together because there was nowhere else to go with what they carried. The CBC's Fifth Estate, broadcast on the Allen Memorial and Cameron in 1980, gave them a template. They began documenting their own cases, recording testimony, gathering what records they could obtain under Ontario's Freedom of Information provisions. The process was slow. Many of the records they requested were refused on grounds of patient privacy, a protection applied with exquisite institutional irony to shield the institution rather than its patients. In 1984, the Ontario government, under Premier Bill Davis, established a formal review body, the Psychiatric Patient Advocate Office, with a mandate to investigate complaints from current psychiatric patients. The mandate explicitly excluded historical claims. It could not investigate what had happened before its creation. This was not an oversight. In 1989, a class of 61 former Hamilton patients, organized by a Hamilton legal aid lawyer named Joan Farber, filed a civil action against the Ontario Crown. The statement of claim ran to 43 pages. It documented committal on non-clinical grounds, treatment without consent, labor without compensation, and long-term harm attributable to treatments administered by the institution. The Crown moved to have the action dismissed on grounds of limitation period. The case was litigated for 4 years. In 1993, the Ontario Court of Appeal ruled that the limitation clock did not begin to run until the plaintiffs had reasonable knowledge of the facts giving rise to their claim, a finding that allowed the action to proceed. It was a significant legal victory. The case settled out of court in 1994. The terms of the settlement were sealed by order of the court. The plaintiffs received compensation whose aggregate amount has never been disclosed. Each plaintiff signed a non-disclosure agreement. Joan Farber was required, as a condition of settlement, to surrender copies of all case materials. In 2005, a woman named Carol Anderson, the daughter of a patient who had died at Hamilton in 1968, attempted to file a fresh action. She was informed by the Ministry of Health that her mother's medical records had been destroyed in a records management exercise conducted in 1997. The records management policy under which the destruction had occurred was described as routine archival practice. Carol Anderson appealed to the Ontario Ombudsman. The Ombudsman found that the destruction had not violated any applicable records retention policy. In 2017, following the Truth and Reconciliation process that had brought Canada face-to-face with the residential school system, a coalition of psychiatric survivor organizations submitted a formal petition to the Ontario legislature requesting a public inquiry into the use of social diagnoses in provincial psychiatric institutions. The petition received 4,200 signatures. It was received by the legislature, referred to committee, and has not been acted upon. The methods that shaped institutions like Hamilton did not vanish when the province reformed its admissions criteria. They traveled. The KUBARK, Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual, compiled by the CIA in 1963, drew from the research performed at the Allen Memorial Institute under Cameron: sensory deprivation, pharmacological regression, the systematic dismantling of the subject's sense of self. What Hamilton's practices shared with KUBARK was not a funding line, but an underlying logic that a person could be rendered tractable by the systematic removal of their capacity to resist, that the goal of control could be achieved through the destruction of the self. In the 1980s, KUBARK's successor document, the Human Resource Exploitation Training Manual, was used by American military advisors to train security forces throughout Latin America. The forces trained using these techniques were later documented in human rights proceedings across Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Chile. The specific techniques targeting women, sexual humiliation, enforced helplessness, the exploitation of the domestic sphere as a site of control, had antecedents not only in American Cold War doctrine, but in the long institutional tradition, visible at Hamilton and dozens of institutions like it, of using the language of care to justify the mechanics of confinement. The detention and interrogation program that operated at Guantanamo Bay after September 11, 2001, drew on this same lineage. James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, the two psychologists contracted by the CIA for $80 million to design the enhanced interrogation program, worked from the same foundational premise that institutions like Hamilton had operated on for a century, that the subject's resistance was a problem to be solved through the systematic application of disorientation, deprivation, and helplessness. Abu Zubaydah was waterboarded 83 times in 19 days. A Senate investigation later concluded the techniques produced no intelligence of value. What they produced, from Barton Street in 1876 to Guantanamo Bay in 2002, was always the same. A person systematically dismantled by an institution that had decided, in advance, that their resistance was the evidence of their disorder. The logic is older than Cameron. It is older than Hamilton. It persists. The building stands today on the West 5th Street campus of St. Joseph's Healthcare Hamilton. It has been renamed. The sign at the entrance reads, St. Joseph's Healthcare Hamilton, West 5th Campus. The words Psychiatric Hospital do not appear on the sign. The Victorian brick of the main building is still intact, the same Credit Valley red that Kivas Tully specified in 1875, weathered now, the mortar between the courses a dusty gray. The clock tower still rises above the roofline, its clock face maintained by the institution, its hands set to the correct time. From the parking lot, the building still projects the authority it was designed to project. It is still, unmistakably, an institution. Inside, the original wards have been reconfigured multiple times. The dining hall is now administrative office space. The hydrotherapy basement was sealed in the 1970s and has not been opened since. The women's ward on the second floor of the eastern wing houses, today, outpatient services and meeting rooms. The farm is gone. The orchard is a parking lot. The numbered graves in the western section of the grounds are still there. Some of them, those that were marked at all, with small concrete slabs bearing numbers rather than names. The names were in the ledger. Some of the ledgers were destroyed. The numbers remain. A portrait of Dr. Harold Lefebvre hung in the administrative corridor until 2008, when it was removed without announcement during a building renovation. It has not been replaced. There is no portrait of Agnes Milligan. There is no portrait of Dorothy Ferrante. There is no portrait of Ruth Goldenberg. There is no plaque at the entrance acknowledging that women were committed to this building for reasons that had nothing to do with psychiatric illness. There is no memorial in the grounds for the patients whose names the numbered graves do not carry. The institution publishes an annual report on the quality of its current services. The annual report does not reference the period before 1970. Psychiatric services still operate on this campus. People still receive care here. Some of them receive good care. The institution that produced the good care and the institution that produced the harm exist inside the same brick walls. Neither has been fully named. There are two Hamilton psychiatric hospitals. The first was built on the premise, genuine if paternalistic, that the suffering of the mentally ill deserved a humane institutional response. That premise produced real care for some patients, for whom the institution was genuinely the best available option. It also produced, from its first year, a parallel function: the absorption of women who were not mentally ill, but who were defined as a social problem by the men and the systems around them. The first Hamilton Psychiatric Hospital believed, in its official communications, that it was doing good. What it was doing, for a significant portion of its population, was providing a legal mechanism for the disposal of inconvenient women. The second Hamilton Psychiatric Hospital came into existence in the mid-20th century. When the treatments arrived, the insulin comas, the ECT without anesthesia, the lobotomies, and the province funded them without independent oversight, and the institution administered them without meaningful consent. And the women in the wards received them because the women in the wards had no legal mechanism to refuse. These are not two separate stories. They are the same story, running through the same building, across the same century, sustained by the same structural condition, that the people making decisions inside these walls were answerable to the province, and the province was never meaningfully answerable to the patients. That is an observation. It is not a comfort. It is not a resolution. It is simply what the record shows. Some questions that remain. How many women were admitted to Hamilton Psychiatric Hospital under non-clinical diagnoses across the full period of its operation? The surviving records document 340 cases between 1920 and 1955. The records before 1920 are incomplete. The records between 1955 and the admission reforms of the late 1960s have not been fully analyzed. The true number is larger. No one in authority is currently attempting to determine how much larger. What happened to the children of the women who were committed? Thomas Milligan spent a lifetime looking for a mother he did not remember. He is not the only one. The children's aid records from this era are held in provincial archives under a 75-year access restriction that, for the earliest cases, is only now beginning to expire. What is in the sealed 1980 inquiry findings? The provincial government has twice refused Freedom of Information requests for the classified review. The second refusal, in 2019, described the materials as containing information whose disclosure could reasonably be expected to prejudice the economic interests of the Crown. Not the dignity of the patients, not the historical record, the economic interests of the Crown, who, specifically, signed the classification order in 1980. The name appears in the Ministry archive under a redaction. The archive index confirms a name was there. The name is not there now. Will there be a public inquiry? The 2017 petition sits in committee. The committee has not met to discuss it since 2018. The admission ledger sits in the Ontario archives now, one of the surviving volumes, the one that covers the years 1929 to 1937. It is catalogued as Series RG10-162-0-7. It is available to researchers who know to request it. The ruled columns still carry the names in careful cursive ink. Agnes Milligan is on page 47, patient number 7841. Moral insanity in the diagnosis column, in a hand that gives no indication of uncertainty. The ink has not faded. At the opening of this story, that ledger looked like record keeping. It looked like care, the institution accounting for itself, the province documenting its responsibility. By now you know what it actually was. It was the instrument that made disappearance look like medicine. The column ruled for diagnosis, was ruled for erasure. The careful cursive was the handwriting of a system that had decided, in advance, that some women's names were easier to manage when followed by a number. The ledger still exists. The women's names are still in it. The names are still waiting for something from the province that has not come. What does a government owe to the women it classified out of existence? What does an institution owe to the people it absorbed? When the record itself is part of what was used against you, what does accountability even look like? The clock on the tower still runs. The brick still holds the weight of what happened inside it. And somewhere in an archive box in a building on Grenville Street in Toronto, Agnes Milligan's file sits in the dark, the number assigned to her still legible, her name still waiting for someone to say it out loud, without the word insane attached to it. We said it. It was not enough.